Welcome to our third Friday legal webinar for the month of March. My name is Sandra Vidrio, and it is a pleasure to welcome you at our weekly webinars. Our topic for today is going to be navigating commercial leases, and we have the team from New Business Community Law Clinic joining us to provide us with a wonderful presentation, followed with the Q&A session and some other opportunities for you as a business owner. I want to take this time to inform you that we will be using the Zoom meeting control features to submit your questions, your comments during the meeting. That way we can answer them at the end of the presentation. And if you guys are joining us in Spanish, tenemos interpretación simultánea en español, así que simplemente seleccione el icono de interpretación que aparece en su pantalla. Si está usando una tableta, por favor de seleccionar aquí donde dice More, Language Interpretation, seleccionar español para que puedan escuchar la presentación de hoy en español. Cualquier pregunta que tengan, por favor déjala en el chat y haremos nuestro mejor intento para poder contestar su pregunta en el momento. Y la interpretación está brindando el equipo de Lingüística Team, así que gracias a Lika por estar conectada el día de hoy. This is our agenda for today. I'm going to share a little bit updates on what we have going on here at the Fresno Area Hispanic Foundation, and we will be joined by Bill Kell, Clinic Director at the New Business Community Law Clinic, in addition to some student participants. The Fresno Area Hispanic Foundation, if this is your first time joining, welcome to our weekly webinars. As mentioned, we are here to help and serve our small business community. We have a variety of programs and services offered to businesses, not just in Fresno County, but throughout the San Joaquin Valley, throughout the state of California, and even nearby states. So we have our technical assistance program, which is one-on-one consulting if you're in the process of wanting to start a business. We have programs available for you on how to get started. In the month of April, we will be launching a cohort, an accelerated curriculum cohort program designed for businesses that launch their business after July 1st, 2019. And so we will make sure to keep you posted on those opportunities. As all you have to do is participate in a 16-hour training, and you will be working with us one-on-one, creating your business plan. And then from there, you'll have the opportunity to apply for up to a $10,000 grant funded through the state of California. We will also be continuing with our Womanpreneur program in the month of May, Latinapreneur, Womanpreneur. So that's another opportunity to continue growing your capacity as a business owner, learning those tools to be able to market your business in this new transition from the pandemic, this new market era. And we also have microloan opportunities available for not just for business, but also for consumers as well. And I want to encourage you to follow us on our social media platforms, write down our contact information. That way we can continue the conversation if you have any other questions. And I want to make sure to share with you what our upcoming webinar lineup looks like. So next Friday, we will be having another webinar on the topic of credit. So we will be having a presenter from JPMorgan Chase Bank providing information on credit, how to monitor your personal credit, the importance of monitoring your credit, as well as opportunity to connect with an expert in the subject matter. And on March 29, we will be having a representative from H&R Block providing a presentation as to your small business during COVID-19 and tax season, how to prepare for those resources. And our third Friday legal webinar will be taking place April 15 on the topic of raising capital. So as you can see, a lot of financial topics coming up on your way. And with that, no more longer introduction. I will pass it on to Bill Kell to share his screen and provide today's presentation. So thank you, Bill.
Thank you so much, Sandra. So let's see, we're gonna turn on to my screen. Here we go, everyone. Looks very similar. So let me get to the first slide here. Okay, well, welcome everyone. So we're the New Business Community Law Clinic. I'm assisted today by Sam Boomgarden and also NC Shao, who are going to do a few of the slides. But the first thing we want to just flag for you is that commercial leases are, probably a different kind of animal than your residential lease that you might be having there. The first time we started counseling about these things, the thing that always floored me was, wow, commercial leases, like 10 years, 5 years, 20 years. Oh my gosh, why would anybody why would anybody want to have a lease that long? I mean, gosh, couldn't there be things that go wrong during that time? Well, yeah, and one of them, as we all knew, was like COVID coming through here. That was, maybe it put some pressure on you to be able to even use your space during this period of time. So I guess what we want to flag right at the beginning is that leases, yeah, matter an awful lot, because there could be things that happen during this long period of time that you have this relationship with the landlord. That's probably a good idea to work out the terms at the beginning if you can. And nobody saw COVID coming, of course, but now, seeing what could happen, Sam's going to talk about some of the things you should maybe negotiate about at the beginning. But it makes sense that you do a lease this long, because you have changes you want to make to that business space. Maybe you also want people to know you. You want a word of mouth. Oh, where's that cookie store that we knew about? Oh, it's downtown on that corner. Oh, well, that's where people get word of mouth with you, because you've been there for a long period of time. So it makes sense you want to enter in these kinds of long-term relationships. It's just, you got to do it, probably a little even more carefully than your residential lease. And that's what we're going to cover today. So just to start, a disclaimer, of course, we always have to do this. Individual legal advice is when we talk with you individually. It's not when we give you a workshop. So just so you know, this is general legal advice. If you want to talk to us individually, yeah, just talk to Sandra, or we'll put in the chat, and at the last slide, it has our email that you can email us to sign up for office hours, because we offer those every week, Monday and Wednesday, 11 to 2 p.m. You could talk for 45 minutes for free with an attorney and a law student, and that way get some individualized advice. Okay, so let's keep going. The agenda for today. Well, we have, probably most important advice. I've already previewed that, and then that is to, negotiate for what you need at the beginning. Sam's going to talk a little bit about that. But then, NC's going to talk a little bit about the different types of rent, some of the different lease clauses that you want to pay attention to going forward. I'm going to cover some things about and also defaults if for some reason you're unable to pay the rent or follow some obligation under the lease. Some options for resolving disputes, and then flag a couple of things related to courts and evictions and things like that, and then we'll finish with a little top 10 reminder thing going forward. All right, so Sam, take it away. Tell us what's one of the most important things for clients who are about to do commercial lease arrangements.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. So the first thing we're gonna kind of touch on is how important it is to get your lease in writing. So as it says here, verbal agreements don't count, and so technically there's a little bit of an exception to that, where if it's for less than 1 year, then you could have a verbal agreement that would be enforceable. But for anything longer, a year or longer, a verbal agreement has no kind of legal enforceability. But even if you're under that 1 year, it's still ideal to get it in writing, just so you know, and then you don't have to go through kind of the complicated thing of trying to figure out what was actually orally agreed to. So always really important to get everything in writing. Unlike in the residential context, the commercial lease governs almost all of the tenant's rights. So when you're in the residential context, there are a lot of things that, and a lot of rights that the law kind of by default gives to tenants. But with commercial leases, they kind of assume, even though it's not always the case, the law kind of assumes that tenants and their landlords are on equal footing when they're negotiating. Almost all the rights that tenants will have will be written directly into their contracts. So it's really important to have a written contract and then have every right that you want to make sure that you have written into that contract. And again, you want, because the contract is the by far like kind of the most governing and includes all of the rights that you'll have. It's important to know each and every one of the clauses that are in there and make sure you understand them. And so the best way to do that is to have a lawyer review and explain each part of it before you sign. And feel comfortable like asking questions. So you want to make sure you understand each part. And so that if there's a clause that you don't understand, it's good to ask questions before signing, and don't cave in to pressure to sign. Once you sign, then it becomes legally enforceable. So, you have the most power before you sign, and you want to make sure you use that. And don't, if the landlord is pressuring you, saying, you have 1 week and I can't talk to you anymore about it, then that's kind of a red flag. And you want to make sure you understand each part, you have time to think about it, and you know what each part means. And if you need more time, then make sure to ask for it.
Okay.
And the next part is negotiate. Again, like I said, you have the most power in the negotiations before you sign. Once you sign, then it's kind of a done deal and everything's locked in. And so, you really should feel comfortable negotiating about all terms, because every term and every clause in the contract is negotiable, and you just have to feel comfortable asking. It sometimes, I think, might feel like uncomfortable or like you can't, but it really is kind of how these things work, especially. So you kind of just have to ask, and it shouldn't really throw anybody off. And it, like I said, it's easier to ask it more at the beginning than later. Once you sign, everything's locked in, so you want to do all the negotiating before signing. And for each clause, it's kind of easy to think of it as you want to know the specifics. So you want to know who, what, when, and how. Who's responsible, what they're responsible for, when they're responsible for that, and how much they're responsible for. And a way to do this is kind of think of the worst case scenario possible for each clause or each kind of situation. So an example might be the air conditioning breaks with only 1 month left in your lease, and the cost to replace it is $10,000. But the landlord wants the tenant to pay for it. So you only have 1 month left, and there's this big expense, but the landlord expects you to pay for it. That's something that kind of a worst case scenario, but something you want to think about and see if that would actually, you would be required to pay under the terms of the lease. So you kind of do want to, at the beginning, think about the worst case scenarios and in any kind of case scenario that might come up, and make sure that the agreement covers it, and it covers it in a way that you're comfortable with.
Great, Sam.
Yeah.
So folks, just one thing I should mention is, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, because then we'll address those in order when we finish up here, and we'll get to all the questions, don't worry, for sure. Hey, thank you, Sam. So now we're going to go to NC, who's going to cover some things about different terms in the agreement here that you should just know about. Yeah, so go ahead, NC.
Hi, so let's go to first of all, the rent, the money you have to pay for the lease. So obviously, from a day-to-day practical perspective, rent is really relevant to our lease. And we got several kinds of rents. The first of all is base rent. The base rent is paying for the bare space you are renting. It is the minimum monthly rent, usually based on square footage of your space. And I would say take your own measurements if possible. So if the room looks like a little bit smaller, or you only see 5 rooms, well, the lease says it has 6. These are definitely things you need to check out before you sign the agreement. As we have mentioned before, commercial leasing is totally different from residential leasing in terms of tenants' protection. So I would highly recommend you mirror it and do some inspection of the property's conditions before you sign the agreement. And now we have net leases. It actually means you are not only charged with the space, but also some of the costs pertinent to the space. For example, a single net means you have to pay for the space plus the property taxes. And of course, you need to, so of course, a reminder to you is this could all be negotiable. This could all be negotiable as well. So the double nets means you have to pay for the property tax, but plus building insurance plus the space. And the triple one adds the operating expenses. You may wonder what are the operating expenses. So utilities like the door lights or janitorial services, taxes, these are all the operating expenses. And I would say tenants' share of additional rent is typically calculated by like sometimes dividing the square footage tenant rents by the square footage of the full building. So first of all, don't forget to ask for historical financial to see what additional rent has been for the space in the past. Also, ask for a clause giving tenant right to perform operations audit to verify that additional rent charges are legitimate. Our key is to limit the amount of additional costs, the amount of additional rent. So ideally, unreasonable costs should be avoided in writing before you sign the agreement. For example, imagine we are leasing a building and a major repair is required to the foundation of the building, or there is a big hole in the roof. So it may cost a lot of fortune. Who should be responsible for it? The tenant or the landlord? Or your landlord is going to add security into this building. I suppose the landlord would pass through some of the cost to you. So what shares are you going to be charged? This should all be negotiable before you sign the agreement. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so now finished with the terminology, let's go to one of the most important issues in analysis, that is the commencement date. This determines when the overall term starts and ends. So the tenants usually would do some improvements and some renovations to the property, and some of the furnitures may just be fixtures to this property. If this property is like, for example, you're a barber and you renovate this property to be a well-furnished barber shop, you may wish to use it for a longer period than the initial lease. So here comes the option. Option is the clause you have already set to make sure your lease has one to extend. Your lease you can actually extend your lease. Timing is pretty crucial because your landlord could easily say no if the period where you are able to exercise this option is passed, maybe even only 1 day late. So definitely pay attention on the timing here. And also the written communication should be sent to exercise that option. Email may not be enough, or email may work at this time, but be alert of the clauses in the lease to see what kind of notice you have to give to your landlord. Okay, next slide, thanks. So if there is no option to extend in the agreement, we would suggest like you can actually negotiate a new rent. Here comes a terminology, fair market rent. This is the monthly rent a particular property type is likely to receive. For example, the fair market rent could be the average of like several units in building of the same grade in the area. And do not assume that rent has gone up. Again, the time you have the most leverage is before you sign the term. So you can actually like get a broker to work into this. And also do not limit your negotiation only to the rent, because like there are also some other terms you want to improve this time compared to your original lease. Okay, next slide. Here we come to the premises. The premises are actually the situations and the conditions of the property before you move in. So the thing you need to do is to, first of all, tour the space before you sign it to make sure the conditions are satisfactory, the conditions are meeting what you want. So make sure the heating, the air conditioning, all the things are in good working order, and you can actually use it when you're moving. Also, the purpose, and also you have to be aware of the as is clause. So what is an as is clause? An as is clause is to force the tenant to rely upon its own investigation, the one you have, rather than upon the landlord's representations in determining whether or not to rent this property, whether or not this property's conditions are satisfactory to you. So like I have mentioned before, be sure to marinate yourself and do some inspection, because the tenant may require, because you are able to request a statement that the building is in compliance with all laws, or it is in a good condition before you have actually moving. Okay, next slide. So if you have recently moved into a new office space or are planning to move soon, you probably have a list of renovations you would like to make. That's pretty common, right? Tenants have the option to push for a tenant improvement allowance in order to help mitigate the costs associated with a build out. Like you need to decorate the shops, the room to be a barber shop. You need to add chairs, lights, and these things are core. These improvements are actually eligible for a tenant's improvement allowance. So the thing we have to mention is what you want to avoid is actually your landlord taking longer than promised to complete the improvements he or she has already promised. So this may cause a situation that the rent becomes due, even though you can't actually move it. So for the landlord's improvements part, be sure when is the completion deadline, and when the rent start date. What is the rent start date? You can actually use the property in a condition you want. And for the tenant's improvements part, be sure that so you may actually do some improvements during the term, like painting the walls, putting in a new shelf, putting in a new shelving or flooring. So your landlord, it may have to give you some consents. They might even want you to postpone to ensure the construction doesn't result in lines being placed on the building. So you have to be sure also the allowance, the tenant's improvement allowance, can it cover the decoration activity you are planning to go to do, and are you supposed to restore the premises at the end of the lease to put it in a original situation?
Awesome.
Okay, so that's all about the part I am responsible.
Oh, sure, Nancy. Thank you very much. That's great. And she also mentioned these things called fixtures, I think it was. You should just know that anything that you put into a space that is, of course, owned by somebody else could become a part of the space, and that's what we call a fixture. Okay, and the definition of the fixture is something that is added to a space that cannot be removed without damaging the space. So yeah, like those big swivel chairs at a barber's office, barber's space. Yeah, it might be that there's, that'll tear up some tile or stuff, and so technically speaking, if you can't get it out without repairing the space or fixing it back up the way it was, it becomes part of the space. And I learned this hard way myself with a residential lease. The tile floor was terrible. We said to the landlord, oh, could we put a new tile? She said, sure. And then at the end of our lease, 5 months later, she said, well, I think I'm gonna rent it to somebody else, or we're gonna take it over ourselves. Oh, thanks for the nice tile job. Yeah, so just know that there was no way we could pick that up. It became part of the space, yeah. So now we're going to check on one thing. Now, remember this thing that Nancy was saying was watch out for this as is clause. Well, one of the big reasons you watch out for that is this thing called the Americans with Disabilities Act. Why? Because the ADA is all about accessibility to different commercial spaces. And what it says is, it's a federal act, it says that landlords and tenants are responsible for making sure that the space is accessible. It does mean that if your landlord has put into the lease either that you took the space as is, okay, or if they said some tenant is responsible for all sort of improvements or changes or legal compliance or something like that, well, then they probably just put this bill on your head there, because it can be more expensive. And there are some kind of shady lawyers who can try to shake businesses down and say, oh, you don't have a ramp here, so we're going to sue you unless you put in this ramp. And so, it's a lot of money that we're potentially talking about to make spaces accessible that haven't been. And so now here's one thing you should know, is that there is this thing called a CASP, and I'm trying to remember what it stands for. It's something like Certified Accessibility Specialist or something like that. And cities have them, counties have them. There are also private people available too. And so this is the thing, if you go to rent a space and you aren't sure whether it's in compliance with the ADA, you can hire one of these CASP people to do an inspection. And you got to know that if there's been a previous CASP inspection on the space to tell you what is needing to be done to make it accessible, the tenant has a right to see that report before, and they get to, you might want to ask about that before you're signing there, just to make sure again that the landlord's not trying to pass this cost of this on you. All right. Oh, here it is. All leases signed after January 1st, 2017, the landlord is actually required to disclose whether there's been an inspection there. Okay. If there's been no inspection, then I guess the thing I would propose is to say, look, landlord, either you conduct an ADA assessment with a CASP or something like this, or my cost as tenant is going to be proportional to the time I'm in the space. So maybe if you're in the space for 20 years, you should pay for more of the ADA upkeep than somebody who's only there for a couple of years, you see. All right. Normally the landlord, I guess I would tend to say normally the landlord, this should be their cost, because it's going to change and improve their space that you're going to leave someday. So, all right. A few other things to make sure you have your release. Who's responsible for fixing up what? Yeah, Sam pointed this out before. Generally, things the roof, things like that. Generally, the landlord is going to be held responsible for that. But the interior is maybe what you would be responsible for. So it could be that a light fixture, shorts out or something. Yeah, the landlord might say that's something you need to fix. So it's always good to have in your lease what things the landlord will fix and what things you will fix. There's also some things that sometimes the landlord will say, well, I'll be responsible for the cost of it. You just have to fix it and then deduct it from the rent, you see. Okay, so again, the idea is when things are to be fixed, and if you are responsible for it, the best thing to do is to say, well, we're going to amortize it. What that means is we're going to spread the cost over its useful life or over the life of the of the rental relationship that we have. So that example that Sam gave about, not paying for the whole air conditioning fix when you only have one more month on your leases, and it's just not fair. All right, Sam, you were going to talk about a couple of things about assignment and subleasing. This is another thing to pay attention to. Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
Yeah. So this is kind of talking about if you want to transfer your lease to somebody else. And so then you can be assignment is when you transfer the full lease, a complete transfer of lease, and subleasing is where you transfer just part of the lease. And so we'll address those separately. But so we'll do assignment first, which again is complete transfer of the rest of the lease that you have. So an example of this, right, might be if you sell your business, and if you want to transfer the lease for the space that your business used to the person who bought your business. If your lease doesn't allow for assignment, you might not be able to do that, and so you want to make sure that you can. And so typically the tenant will need the landlord's consent in writing to assign it to somebody else. So when you sell your business, you'll have to get your landlord's approval to do it. But you want to make sure the lease specifically says that the landlord can't withhold their consent unreasonably. So you want to have, the word reasonable in all the clauses of the lease.
It's actually also read in by the law if it's not in there. But this is something you should be on the same page with your landlord about for sure. Go ahead,
Sam. And so you also don't want to agree to unreasonable restrictions on assignment. And so that's kind of one of those things of like, a landlord might say, we'll let you assign it, but only if we can like double the rent for the new person, or if you renovate the entire space or something like that. So you don't want to agree to them requiring some sort of you doing something in order for them to consent to the assignment. And I guess the last little part about assignment is just that usually the new tenant that you sell or that you assign the lease to will pay the rent directly to the landlord. But then sometimes the original tenant, so you would still be liable if the new tenant defaults on the loan, unless you get the landlord to agree in writing to release that liability. So that's another thing you want to be clear with your landlord about from the beginning, and just really keep an eye on for that. All right. And then subleasing. So subleasing is when you're transferring it, but only a partial transfer. So kind of the alternative example to selling the business is if just your business gets smaller or you need less space for something. And so you might want to sublease a little chunk of the space that you're leasing, to kind of defray some of the costs. And so this also typically requires the landlord's written consent. But now in this, it's different because in this way where the subtenant, the person who you're subleasing to, will pay the rent directly to you, and then it'll help you pay your lease to the landlord. And so with that, the subtenant will get like most of the terms of the lease, but the original tenant, you will still be liable. So if your subleaser or subtenant doesn't pay, then you'll still have to pay their portion as well. So it can be a good value because you can lower the ultimate cost that you have to pay by leasing out a chunk of your space, but it can also be risky because you'll be on the hook still, even though you didn't get the space, get to use it if your subtenant doesn't pay. Right. And so then there's just the kind of things when you're signing the subtenant agreement, or when you're subleasing it in the first place, you want to just make sure in your original land or contract with the landlord that what the permitted uses for your space are. So make sure that it says like subleasing is allowed, and what you're allowed to do in the space. So the subtenant isn't doing something with the space that you're not allowed to do. So yeah.
Very good.
Thank you, Sam. Does that cover?
Yeah, that does. Now, one thing to make subleasing and assignment a little better for the landlord is probably a good idea to sort of check out the people that you're going to bring in as as an assignee, as we call them. That sounds pejorative, but as somebody who is taking it over, or somebody who's subleasing, do a credit check on them or get some references on them. I mean, any of those things that you do is going to make the landlord certainly feel better about stuff. All right, well, I'm going to cover a few other things that look in the leases about things. Insurance. Usually a landlord will want you to get commercial liability insurance, and we always recommend commercial liability insurance no matter what you're doing, because that will hire a lawyer for you to pay for any injury or damage, to fight a lawsuit, but then also they'll pay out if there is property damage that is a result of your business operations. Now, there's this thing called waiver of subrogation. I know it's kind of a technical term, but the idea is it's a good idea to get a waiver of subrogation, because what you have is the landlord will have their own insurance carrier, and then you'll have your insurance carrier. And so what will happen here is sometimes the insurance companies will get into a squabble about who should pay. Waiver of subrogation simply says, look, if a landlord, let's say that somebody slipped and fell on your steps or something like that, and it's clearly the landlord's fault, well, then the waiver of subrogation will take care of the problem, where the landlord's insurance company will say, oh, well, clearly there's something maybe that the tenant did that made this happen, so we're going to sue their insurance company to make sure that they pay their full amount. Well, waiver of subrogation pretty much says, look, if the landlord is if one party's insurance clearly should cover, then we're not going to go after the other insured person for a small amount that they really aren't, responsible for. Okay, could be mutual. A good idea is to make it mutual. So then each insurance company will behave on that. Certainly, before you rent, check the zoning plan for your area to make sure you comply with the zoning laws. So, for example, if you're trying to rent a building and they don't allow, I don't know, something that you're doing, like making emissions, let's say you're roasting coffee, maybe in that area, they don't allow emissions of some sort. Well, that's going to trump any kind of lease that you have there. Even if you signed a lease, you won't be able to do your coffee roasting if the zoning plan doesn't allow it. So definitely check to make sure that your particular use allows it. Here's one I should point out is if you're operating a business out of your home, well, you may still have a landlord there, of course, if you're renting, and you may need what's called a home occupation permit. So you want to go to the zoning board, make sure that you get that permit. That way your landlord isn't going to be able to say, oh, but it's an unpermitted use. Well, again, they could say in their lease no business uses of a space, but sometimes state law will actually define certain uses of a space as residential. So for example, childcare, doing childcare in your home is not a business use of your home because it's consistent with neighborhood uses. Kids live at home all the time. So that's where, even if your landlord said no businesses here, that's the thing. You're by law on the state of California doing a residential use of your business when you do childcare. Okay, but there are other businesses where that's true too. So let's see. Oh, and then of course you could look for a variance. A variance would be, it's a little more complicated, but yeah, let's say that that coffee roaster example there. Let's say that I really, I signed the space, I signed the lease, and oh, now they're telling me I can't do my coffee roasting business here. Okay, well, you can always go to the zoning board and say, look, can I get a variance? A variance is just a change in the zoning status, and what you normally have to do in that is get your neighbor's approval. But if your neighbors are okay with it, and you come into the zoning board with that, it's a good chance that you could get a variance going forward. That means a change in the zoning use. All right, well, now we're going to start talking about some things, that we'd rather not talk about, but are true, is you might get into default in some fashion. You can't make your obligations, you can't pay your rent, you can't follow the obligations in the lease there. Well, that's what's called default. And default, as I said, can be economic, you're not paying rent, or non-economic, you can't, you're doing something that the landlord says you can't do in the space, and you just are not able to comply with it. Well, normally a good lease will have what's called a notice and cure period. That means that if the landlord comes along and says, hey, you haven't been paying your rent, and oh, you haven't been doing these obligations, you have a little time to fix it. Yeah, like maybe 10 or 30 days to fix these kinds of things. And here's another question, I suppose, is if the landlord didn't come to you to complain about these things, let's say you were supposed to have, I don't know, here you go, you came in and you put up a sign that was too big, and your landlord's, in the lease, it said the sign has to be this size and your sign is too big. Okay, well, normally you would need to get notice. I mean, you might be under an existing obligation to change it, and you might be a nice person and change it, that's fine. But if the landlord, you didn't hear anything from them, they didn't complain about it, well, there's this idea that potentially a waiver may have happened there. If you had that thing up for 5 years and the landlord only complained in year 6, well, you might have an argument for a court saying, obviously you've waived that part of the rent by in the lease by letting me do it, for 5 years. Okay, so if you got your default situation, you're trying to cure it, maybe you can't cure it. How do you resolve a dispute like this? Well, there's 2 ways to do it. Actually, 3 ways. First is, of course, without saying here, you can negotiate, try and reach a settlement, good faith, hear each other out, pay attention to not the positions that are taken, like the landlord, like absolutely you have to pay on time. Okay, well, that's a position. All right, well, maybe you want to ask what's behind that position. Is it because you need to be paid on time because you have to pay the mortgage on time? Okay, well, when is the mortgage due? Okay, well, it's due on the 15th. Oh, so mine is due on the 10th. Okay, well, if I get it to you the 14th, as long as it's in good shape and you can pay by the 15th, is that a problem? The landlord might say, well, I guess that's going to be okay. But you see how he took a position first. You want to sort of get behind what that position is, because once you have a sense of what the interests are, then you can potentially negotiate and make sure that they get their interest and you get your interest, you see. So another way to do this, if you haven't been able to negotiate it yourself, is to get into something called mediation. We used to have a free service. I'm sorry, I should have taken that out. We used to have a commercial lease mediation service because of COVID, but since the pandemic's over, that's no longer the case. I should take that out. But mediation, you should know, is there's a couple of agencies in the Fresno area that do this. It's for a fee, but they will have somebody who helps the 2 of you come together in an agreement. The distinguishing part between that and arbitration is just that in arbitration, the arbiter, the one who is hearing the case, can impose a decision on you. They can hear from both sides and actually say, I decide this. Whereas mediation, they only help you come to agreement. They can't enforce anything. So these are a couple of things to think about. Again, negotiate first, try mediation, try arbitration before you go to court, because going to court is so, it will really bankrupt almost anybody. Got some bad news here, guys, is that there used to be commercial tenant eviction moratoriums, but almost all of those, well, I mentioned Alameda and Contra Costa here because this was a slide from the East Bay, but I know that Fresno County and Merced County and all of the counties in the Central Valley pretty much did away with their moratoriums back in September. So normally what happens then is you have at least 6 months to start paying again, and that's already come and gone with February. So unfortunately, there aren't really any rent moratoriums that are going to save you at this point, I'm afraid. Again, have to just go back and negotiate. All right, so what happens if the landlord comes after you? Well, there's 2 reasons they may come after you. Non-payment of rent. Well, this is a problem because they do have this 3-day notice to pay or quit notice that they can bring against you. It's kind of a quick eviction here. They have, they give it to you 3 days notice. You can respond, you better respond. But if the rent is still not paid, or, if you pay the rent, then it stops the notice here and it stops the court proceeding. But if you don't pay, then yes, comes right in, immediately to court, and they can kick you out. Now there's some other reasons that can be brought, this notice to vacate. Again, you're doing something in the lease you're not supposed to. Any of those things could also bring a notice to vacate. And just know that even in a month-to-month tenancy, there's usually a 30-day notice to vacate in those situations. But a 3-day notice is the thing that the landlords can bring really quickly on you. And what it requires is that they show the court that they served it on you. So it might actually be brought to you by a sheriff or somebody else, and put in your hand there. And as I said, full payment of the delinquent rent will basically broom out the 3-day notice. Then the tenant is also served with this eviction notice. You see, tenant has 5 calendar days to answer in court, right? And of course, you want to bring any defenses for non-payment. Maybe the landlord didn't let you have access to the space. Maybe you're not paying rent because they started doing a construction job and it just made the space unusable because of noise or dust or something like that. Well, it would certainly be a defense to the non-payment of rent. And of course, if you don't answer, then the court moves pretty quickly. Okay. Once they receive an answer, then the court has to set this trial date of 20 days. Of course, if there's a settlement, here's a really important thing. Make sure the stipulations papers specify, that there was a settlement, and that way the eviction doesn't go on your record, because if you have a record of evictions, then it's going to be much harder to lease going forward. If somehow then the court judgment is for the landlord, well, you can expect probably 2 weeks to get out of there. The sheriff will come, they'll lock it up. You have 15 days to reclaim property that was left after you were locked out. So, again, probably a good idea to get a lawyer if you want, once you get a notice to vacate, because they'll know this process. We're just giving you sort of the basics there. All right, well, finally, we just want to cover a few things about lease negotiations. You should just know that landlords used to have substantial leverage because they could use this 3-day thing on here. The reason that there's a little less leverage is that there's so many properties out there that are vacant, and a landlord now cannot be sure that if they get you out, that there is actually somebody else going to come in. So, as I said, normally a landlord will be trying to get you out, but they're also very cognizant of the idea that, hey, they don't want empty space. They do want, if you're paying something, that's better than nothing. And so just know that there may be some motivation on their side to reach some terms on here. So let's see, some modifications we've heard of so far. If somebody can't pay rent, well, certainly deferral. That's what happened during the pandemic. There might be some forgiveness, okay, with a promise to continue paying. The landlord could say, well, okay, I'll take 10% less as long as you keep paying, as long as you, like, every month have an auto deduct from your bank account. Okay, well, that might be a way of working it out. Security deposit could be used to cover rent. There could be a rent structure based on your revenue. It could say, well, I understand you're hitting some hard times here. How about, you hit you have a certain percentage of your sales that will be your rent or something like that. But of course, if you agree to any of that, there's got to be, the presumption is that you're going to continue in business and you're not going to, file bankruptcy or something like that. Let's see, anything else? Yeah, so a landlord's going to say, well, is this tenant, who can't pay right now, is it just a temporary thing, or is it long-term they're not going to be able to pay? Nobody wants a roller rink. Are we going to have roller rinks again after the pandemic? Maybe. Okay. So you have to think about the potential long-term viability of the space. Short-term, is it possible they're going to file for bankruptcy? Because if they file for bankruptcy, then I'm just in line behind several other creditors. So that's not going to be a good situation. Yeah, how likely is it that I can replace the tenant if I go after them like this? So just, hear them out. Find out if they have their own investors, they have their own mortgage to pay. There might be some ways you could work some things out. Okay, so let's see, couple of tenant defenses you should just know about. Yeah, if there was, here you go, you moved into a mall, and Nordstrom's, was one of the reasons you moved into the mall, and then Nordstrom's moved out. Okay, well, then you might be able to say, look, one of the main reasons I came here was that anchor tenant, and now they're gone. And so I'm not going to be, making as much money as I thought. So that's one. Frustration of purpose or force majeure. These are things that are like, well, okay, I have a space in a mall, but part of it burned down, and the mall's now not going to be accessible, or it's under, renovation or something. People can't really get to my space. That would be frustration of purpose or force majeure, a fire. Nobody could have predicted a fire was going to happen, things like that. Landlords do have responsibility to mitigate damages. That means that if you, say you can't rent, you can't pay your rent, you have to leave, the landlord is generally required to try and relet the place, and so that you don't have all that, piling up missed rent and stuff like that. But there is a clause, this little tricky clause, 195, section 1951.4, that says I don't have to mitigate if you put that in. Well, and just, I guess you look out for that if you have that. Hopefully landlords are going to be mitigated. Now, there is this one other little thing that you should know. It's something called a deed of trust. And this is a way that a landlord could actually evict you without a court proceeding, pretty much. It's that they have the lease is not given to you, the lease is given to a trustee who's holding the lease. And so then if you fail to meet your obligation, the trustee can always revoke your ability to have possession of the space. It's a much more summary proceeding with court than even that 3-day notice thing. So just know if you get a deed of trust, you're a little more on a shorter leash about if something happened and you couldn't pay. All right, guys, these are the things we wanted to cover. I did want to point out a few other resources. So when you are looking at a lease, we have our Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights in San Francisco has developed what we call a fair and just commercial lease. So what that means is you might compare it to the lease that you just got from the California, Realtors Association or something like that, which is going to be more commercial landlord friendly, you see. So if you'd like a copy of that, we'd be happy to share that with you. Nolo Press is always a really good lay friendly set of books. There's a couple of libraries that hold these for free about how to not only start a business but also negotiating a favorable lease, those sorts of things. These are really good books. And then we got our top 10 reminders. Okay, as we close it down, make sure you write your lease, make sure it's a written lease. Even if that under 1 year, you could have it oral, have it be in writing. Definitely read and negotiate at the beginning of your lease. That's when you got the most power. Know what the rent is and what's included. Know the different terms that you have. The term of the lease. Make sure you know how long you have and whether you have an option to extend that. Certainly know the condition of the premises before you rent, before you give away, saying that I'll take the premises as is. Certainly find out if there's been a prior ADA assessment on it, things like that. Know who's going to pay for these improvements, that you've identified that you want to make, that the landlords want to make. Make sure you identify who's going to make those improvements and when. Same thing with who's fixing things when they go wrong. Definitely have some insurance. Know if you can assign or sublease, because that's always one. And finally, make sure that any default that you have does have this notice and cure period. That means that if the landlord lets you know something's wrong, you have some time to fix it before you get kicked out. All right, guys, that's pretty much what we got to cover. If you have questions, let's take some of those now. Here's our sign up for services. So first, you could go to the website to sign up for services. That's where you can just take a link and go get one office hour coming up. Mondays, Wednesdays, 11 to 2. Or you can email us and we'll then plug you into an office hour slot. That's new business law at berkeley.edu. And then finally, just know that we have this great online legal information library for entrepreneurs. It's called OLLI, Online Legal Library for Entrepreneurs. So go ahead and check that out at that link. And there's lots of great articles and overviews and links and stuff there for you if that you can access 24/7. Yeah. And also check us out on Instagram and Facebook for sure. All right, well, I'm going to stop the share here and we'll just start taking some questions if people have them. Looks like we've got some maybe in Spanish. Let's see. Leticia Morales, can somebody maybe translate that for us?
Yes,
Sandra, maybe?
yes, Bill. Her question was more in regards to insurance, but I can have her ask her question live. Es acerca de aseguranza, ¿correcto, Leticia? Sí, okay, ahorita me conecto con usted acerca de ese tema. There's another question here about, can landlords default on their side? And if they do, does that give them the option to end the lease and get out of the lease?
Oh, good question, Benny. Let's see. Yeah, most of the court proceedings that are out there are based on, yeah, the landlord violating something like that. I think what you would do in that situation mostly is you would just give notice to the landlord that you're terminating the lease. Okay, and then that's where the landlord could either say, okay, I'll let you go, or that's where then they would say, no, you can't terminate the lease. They would bring their own action for you, but you wouldn't need to bring an action to get out of the lease. You would just try and terminate it, and then there could be some dispute around that. So, other questions that we have? Let's see. Let's go up here if there were some other things. Ms. Morales, did you get all your questions answered? I hope so. What kind of things are common to
Oh,
negotiate?
sí, me acaba de enviar Sandra
Okay.
que me va a enviar la información por correo. Muchas gracias. Estuvo excelente la disertación de todos.
Okay, so
Can you just
we
ask
can-
like where one can find an agent of security for the permanent makeup?
Agents for security. I'm sorry, what kind of agents? I'm sorry.
Agente de seguros, I think it's agent of security. I see. Sorry, my apologies.
Sí,
Alicia,
mira.
maybe? Go ahead.
¿Puedo hablar,
Mhm.
Alicia?
You need to unmute,
Sí,
Alicia.
claro, puede hacer su pregunta y a nosotros le ayudamos a traducir. No hay problema.
Cuando se mencionó que debemos proteger nuestro negocio, como yo trabajo con gente, hago el permanent makeup.
Yeah, I see.
Puede que haya personas que no, por X circunstancia, no le gustó el trabajo. A veces uno tiene que asegurarse de no tener problemas, que no sé dónde acudir. Yo quisiera saber a dónde acudir con un agente de seguros para si llega a ver esto, pues no haya problema.
Maybe Alicia, could you? Okay, all right, Nancy, go
You
ahead,
just
go
said
ahead.
like she's doing a makeup business, and
Oh, I see.
sometimes like sometimes there is security issues, and like how
You mean
can she
security at the
find,
store? I mean like security people, protecting people, you mean? Or do you mean security deposit? I'm sorry. Alicia, maybe you can,
No, yeah, it's
Alicia,
more.
you're muted. Yeah, go ahead.
It was more about the like, so she does personal services, skin services. So if a client is not satisfied with the job that was performed, what are some legal actions that the business owner should take to protect their service, but at the same time wanting to know more about the insurance that they would need for their business.
I see. Okay. All right. So a couple of things there, if somebody could translate. The best insurance to get, of course, is general commercial liability insurance that covers anything that any damages that the business might have. So let's say somebody, you were fixing them up for a wedding and they were really upset that that they didn't look as good for their wedding as they wanted to. Yeah, well, that's where insurance would probably pay for any kind of suit that they would bring on that part there. Let's see.
Es como que ella
Well,
está
here's one thing, and this came from,
ella no está satisfecha del trabajo que uno hizo y ella te quiere demandar porque no le gustó el trabajo que tú le hiciste. A eso me refiero. Te quiere demandar y dice, regrésame mi dinero, pues uno le puede regresar, pero ¿qué tal si sí hizo bien el trabajo y ella hay gente mañosa que no quiere que le regreses su dinero?
Okay, so in regards to this, yes, in regards to service business, sometimes there are very few times when the job performed was correct, but the client wasn't satisfied and they're threatening about doing a lawsuit, even though the job performed was correctly done. So how to go about protecting.
Yes, that's tough. Well, I mean, the first thing I would do with something like that is, of course, offer to say, okay, well, look, I'm sorry you didn't have it the way you wanted it. Look, I'll refund your money, just to sort of get them gone. Lawsuits, yeah, the thing is with lawsuits, what they'll have to do is take you to small claims court. And you just got to know that small claims court, there's no lawyers involved with something like that. And so that's where they could claim up to, I think it's $5,000 worth of damage or something like that. And you would just bring your receipts, you'd bring, they bring whatever proof they had and, come together on a day that the judge sets up for you. Nobody's going to be filing a lawsuit for more than, I mean, lawsuits in and of themselves take at least $10,000 or $15,000 of legal fees to bring. So nobody's going to bring a suit unless they had more damage than that. Normally they'll come to small claims court, and that's where you just have to show how you were reasonable, and the other side will get to argue, and no lawyers. Well, actually, one really important thing though is when you go to small claims court, don't make a claim against the other side. If somebody's bringing you to small claims court, don't claim against them too, because that gives them the ability to appeal beyond what the small claims judge did. If it's only one side answering the other side,
Sí,
but no two claims,
correcto. Yo
then,
tengo un acuerdo de consentimiento.
then it just stays with the
Okay.
small claims court.
Gracias.
And that's,
Era
yeah,
una
that's
duda. Entonces.
cheaper and everything, and gives you closure. Yeah. But yeah, other than that, I don't know. Sometimes, well, here you go. This might be applicable to your situation. There was a really funny television series called Fleabag, and in it, this woman came and she said, "Look at what he did to my hair! Look at what he did to my hair!" And her sister said, "Oh my gosh, we got to do something! Oh, that's horrible!" And so they came back to the place, and the guy says, "Okay, this was what she wanted. She pointed to this picture. And this is what she wanted, and it was exactly the same as she got." And so they went, "Okay, all right." I just chose badly. so some of those things, actually warn people, I suppose. There are some things that, if you make your nails look like this, here you go. If you make your nails this long, you're not going to be able to type. I'm sorry. There's no damage from that because you asked for it. That's, I don't know. I don't have very much other ideas on that other than truth is the best, and full disclosure is the best. I'm sorry. And insurance. Yeah. Okay, well, let's see. Were there other questions? And of course, please, Ms. Morales, follow up with us directly if you have other questions, of course, yes. All right, any other questions that people have?
Those were the only two questions here on the chat box. I know
Okay.
someone wants to unmute themselves and ask their question
Yeah.
live, but we got a lot of good
Happy to do
ideas
that.
as to like future topics, with contracts, small claims. So we'll be working on that for the fall cohort, for the fall
Sure.
sessions.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Perfect. Well,
Okay, well, everybody, thank you.
yes, and everybody will be receiving a copy of the presentation for today, the recording. That way you can review it at your own terms and save a copy of those top 10 suggestions when it comes to commercial leasing negotiation.
Thank you.
So
And next
thank
time
you.
we're going to talk about capital, raising capital for your business. Be sure to come to that.
Yes, so April 15 at 1
April
p.m.
15th.
Yes, thank you. Have a great
Okay,
weekend,
thank you,
everyone.
Sandra. Oh, and thank you, translator. Sam. Thank you so much.